packed with rows and rows of servers that store, process, and communicate data. There are about 60 data centers here in Singapore, and they account for about 7% of the country's total electricity consumption just last year.
Yeah, and that's why earlier this week, the Trade and Industry Ministry temporarily paused the building of new data centers here as they debate a balance between environmental sustainability and growing business needs. Well, let's speak about this more to Omer Wilson, the APAC Marketing Vice President from Digital Realty, a global data center operator. Good evening.
Good evening, Justine. How are you?
Very well. Thanks so much for joining us, Omer. Let's talk first about making data centers more earth-friendly, as it does take a lot of electricity to power them up and also to keep them cool. How can their carbon footprints be smaller?
Yeah, it's a great question. As you said, Singapore has taken a quite forward-looking step, we feel, around just taking stock of the data center growth in the Singapore market, specifically because of the power usage. I mean, data centers are such a critical part of our daily lives, but there's no getting away from the fact that they're high energy consumers. Especially in tropical climates like Singapore and Southeast Asia, where the humidity is so high. Keeping them cool and keeping the temperature just right for these servers and fast computers is key. There's a few different areas, really. Primarily, I guess one is the efficiency of the buildings. When you build in Singapore, you get what's called a BCA Green Mark, a Platinum Award. If you build your facilities at the most efficient manner possible. The reason Singapore gives these awards is because efficiency is key. You don't want to waste energy when you build them. So that's probably one. Getting as much efficiency out of the way we build data centers today is key. Reducing waste. After that, to make enough impact to really hit the global climate targets, you're going to have to start talking about renewable energies and more innovative ways of cooling both the servers and the facilities over time.
Yeah, data centers are a need. They're not a want. We must have them. So tell us how our data centers are connected to the grid. Are they mostly by subsea cables?
They are, yeah. It may amaze quite a few people. I know we hear a lot in the news about satellites these days and links in space connecting people. But the fact of the matter is that today the vast amount of your communications and data traffic, be it video, email, even radio over internet, like we're doing now, primarily for people, is actually going through physical cables. And what that means between countries is that that's going actually via the seabed. If you go right back to the olden days in Singapore, it's what would have been telegrams in those days. That those cables are now the backbone for obviously now much more advanced fiber optic cables running through those physical cases. But it's going through the seabed. Over time, satellite communication and satellite data transfer is going to increase. But today, the vast majority of data is going over via the sea floor, and that's what makes Singapore so unique. It's the amount of subsea cables that land into the country are so many and so important.
Yeah, and Omer, just talking about sea, because here we are one of the top data center markets in the world, but of course land is scarce. Tell us a little bit more about whether this is a reality, floating or submerged data centers.
Yes, it's probably more of a forward, future-looking view. But I know in Singapore, there's a few providers that have looked at, floating data center prototypes and pilots, and that may well be one option over time. One issue you have with data centers, and especially our customer makeup, especially if you look at banks and financial services, is they're quite risk averse. So when you talk about a data center, not just the banks nowadays, any sort of cloud communication, everything we do relies on data centers. So when they go down, it's an impact on a whole population. So when you talk about floating on water, sometimes that's going to take some time to get people used to, I feel, in terms of a large impact. In terms of other options that we've seen, I think the most likely issue immediately is going to be building them higher. So in Singapore already, slowly they're going up to 4 or 5 floors Hong Kong even more so. So I think we'll see higher data centers, obviously making more use of space. And something Singapore's even looked at, very, very future looking, is underground. So not necessarily on the seafloor, but can we dig into the ground? And, Singapore already has a vast underground, subterranean storage and facilities compared to other countries. Could we build them underground? Now they're generally more expensive and can be harder, but that's one option. And then, as you said, seafloor. That Microsoft did a project quite successfully in the North Sea, just north of Scotland, in fact, where they put some servers onto the seafloor and left them there for, I believe, a few years. And they sort of self-ran, obviously, with AI, and that's something that's being looked at. So eventually, they could be everywhere. Is one way to look at it.
It could be a better way of cooling the machines down as well. Now, data is what people call the new black gold. So, what are the prospects for the data center industry and public cloud platforms like Alibaba Cloud as Singapore and the world enter the 5G world and beyond during this COVID-19 pandemic?
Sure, the options are vast. If you look at, there's so many stats that have been given over the last year, I would say, as COVID has really, impacted and hopefully is starting to depart the world, all being well. If you look at the stats from 2019 to 2020, the international internet capacity actually went up 35%. That's a huge amount. It actually went up to about 600 terabits per second from 450. So 35% more internet traffic over the year because of COVID. And the interesting thing is that number isn't sort of a spike that's reducing. It's a spike that looks like it's continuing because people are sort of now looking at hybrid models where they're going to be home much more than previously. So the opportunities for cloud providers and data hubs like Singapore are vast because, everything we do is going to pass through them. And really all industry, all modern industries that spin off from data are going to be dependent on these data centers or the centers of data, as we call them. At Digital Realty, we have a data gravity index because we see data as having, similar to Earths and moons, has a pull like a gravity impact on economies. And that's the impact of data really, and data hubs like Singapore, Hong Kong, Tokyo, New York, etc.
And Omer, we really are, as you say, a big data hub here. So tell us more about big brand data centers. Facebook, apart from them, who else has set up shop here, and how does their presence, do you think, is going to benefit us?
Sure. Facebook's the sort of the most one people have probably seen in the news, but most of the other cloud giants have set up shop or have already had centers in Singapore. It's safe to say all of them. And the reason is, if you speak to any of them, including Facebook, sometimes people ask, there's 5-6 million people in Singapore. Why set up here? What they'll say to you very simply is, the 5-6 million is very valuable to us as a center, but also equally valuable is the 500-600 million that's in the surrounding area. So Singapore is and will continue to be the transition center for the whole Southeast Asia region. Now, over time, that's going to transition where these large cloud and tech companies need to get closer to the user, as they call it, or closer to the edge, which means they're going to have to really set up larger facilities in the large metropolises like Indonesia, Thailand, the surrounding area as well. But I see it as a parallel. I really see that Singapore, once it's taken stock of the power and the environmental situation, is going to continue to be a huge HQ center, let's call it. You see these companies set up regional HQs. The benefit of data centers is that they attract companies. Companies set up their regional offices, they set up their regional data hubs, and that drives the digital economy like a magnet or like a gravity attractor, pulling in other sectors as you have your data in a city.
Yeah. Well, Omer, thank you so much for sharing more of that with us here. Omer Wilson, APAC Marketing Vice President from Digital Realty, a global data center operator.
The sound of our world.